Hezekiah was 25 years old when he began his reign. He ruled for 29 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Abiah, the daughter of Zechariah. He did what was right from Adonai's perspective, following the example everything David, his ancestor, had done. In the first month of the first year of his reign, he reopened the doors of the house of Adonai and repaired them. Then he brought in the Kohanim and the Leviim, assembled them in the open space to the east, and said to them, "Listen to me, Leviim, consecrate yourselves now. Consecrate the house of Adonai, the God of our ancestors, and remove the filth from the holy place. For our ancestors acted treacherously. They did what was evil from the perspective of Adonai, our God. They abandoned him. They turned their faces away from where Adonai lives and turned their backs on him. They sealed the doors of the vestibule, put out the lamps, and stopped burning incense and offering burnt offerings in the holy place to the God of Israel. Because of this, Adonai's anger has settled on Yehudah and Jerusalem, and he has made them an object of horror, astonishment, and mocking, as you can see with your own eyes. Here, our ancestors have fallen by the sword, and on this account our sons, daughters, and wives have gone into captivity. Now it is in my heart to make a covenant with Adonai, the God of Israel, so that his furious anger will turn away from us, my sons. Now is not a time for being negligent. For you are the ones Adonai chose to stand before him and serve him as his ministers, offering him incense." Then the Leviim set about the task. Mechat, the son of Amasa, and Yoel, the son of Ezeryehu, from the descendants of Kahati, and the sons of Mari, Kish, and the son of Avdi, and Ezeryehu, the son of Yehalelel, from the Gershuni, Yoch, the son of Zima, and Eden, the son of Yoch, of the descendants of Elisaphan, Shimri, Yeiel, and the descendants of Asaph, Zechariah, and Mattaniah, and the descendants of Heman, Yachiel, Shimi, and the descendants of Yudatan, Shimya, and Uziel. They gathered the kinsmen, consecrated themselves, and in keeping with the king's order and Adonai's word, went in to cleanse the house of Adonai. The Kohanim went in to cleanse the inner part of the house of Adonai. All the unclean things they found in the sanctuary of Adonai they brought out into the courtyard of the house of Adonai, where the Leviim took and carried them out to the Vadi Kidron. They began consecrating on the first day of the first month, and on the 8th day of the month they reached the vestibule of Adonai. Then they consecrated the house of Adonai in 8 more days, so that on the 16th day of the first month they had finished. Then they went to Hezekiah the king in the place and said, "We have cleansed all the house of Israel, including the altar for burnt offerings, with all its equipment, and the table for the showbread with its equipment. Moreover, we have reconditioned and consecrated all the articles the king Ahaz threw out during his reign, when he was sinning, and they are there in front of the altar of Adonai." Next morning, Hezekiah the king got up early, gathered the leading men of the city, and went up to the house of Adonai. They brought 7 bulls, 7 rams, 7 lambs, and 7 male goats as a sin offering for the kingdom, for the sanctuary, and for Yehudah. And he ordered the Kohanim to offer them on the altar of Adonai. After slaughtering the bulls, the Kohanim took the blood and splashed it against the altar. Next, they slaughtered the rams and splashed the blood against the altar, and also slaughtered the lambs and splashed the blood against the altar. After bringing the male goats for the sin offering close to the king and the symbols and laying their hands on them, the Kohanim slaughtered them and made them a sin offering with their blood on the altar to make atonement for all Israel, and for the king who had offered that the burnt offerings and the sin offerings should be for all Israel. He stationed the Leviim in the house of Adonai with cymbals, lyres, lutes, in keeping with the order of David, Gad, the king's seer, and Natan, the prophet, for the mitzvah had come from Adonai through his prophets. The Leviim stood with the instruments and of David and the Kohanim with the trumpets, Hezekiah ordered that the burnt offering should be offered on the altar. The moment the burnt offerings began, the song of Adonai also began, accompanied by the trumpets and the instruments of David, king of Israel. The whole assembly prostrated themselves, the singers sang, the trumpeters sounded. All this continued until the burnt offerings were finished. When the offering was over, the king and everyone present with him bowed down and prostrated themselves. Then Hezekiah the king and the leaders ordered the Levi'im to sing praises to Adonai, using the words of David and of Asaph the seer. They sang praises until they were filled with joy, and they bowed their heads and prostrated themselves. Hezekiah responded by saying, "Now that you have consecrated yourself to Adonai, come close and bring sacrifices and thank offerings into the house of Adonai." So that the community brought in sacrifices and thank offerings, and as many as were willing volunteered burnt offerings. In all, the burnt offerings brought by the congregation totaled 70 bulls, 100 rams, and 200 lambs. All these were for the burnt offerings to Adonai. The consecrated gifts amounted to 600 oxen and 3,000 sheep. Only there weren't enough Kohanim to skin, butcher all the burnt offerings. So their colleagues, the Levi'im, assisted them until the work was finished, and the Kohanim had consecrated themselves, for the Levi'im had been more diligent to consecrate themselves than the Kohanim. Besides the abundance of burnt offerings, there was the fat of the peace offerings and the drink offerings for the burnt offerings. Thus the service of the house of Adonai was restored. Hezekiah and all the people rejoiced over that what God had prepared for the people, since it had all happened so suddenly. Then Hezekiah sent all Israel and Yehudah and wrote letters also to Ephraim and Manasseh, summoning them to the house of Adonai in Jerusalem and to keep the Pesach to Adonai, the God of Israel. For the king, his officials, and the entire Jerusalem community had agreed to keep the Pesach at the second month. They had not been able to observe it at the proper time because the Kohanim had not consecrated themselves in sufficient number. Also, the people had not assembled in Jerusalem. The idea had seemed right to the king and to the whole community, so they issued a decree that it should be proclaimed throughout all Israel, from Beersheba to Dan, that they should come to keep the Pesach to Adonai, the God of Israel, at Jerusalem, for only a few had been observing it as prescribed. So runners went with the letters from the king and his officers throughout all Israel and Yehudah. They conveyed the king's orders. "People of Israel, turn back to Adonai, the God of Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov. Then he will return to those of you who remain, who escaped capture by the king of Ashur. Don't be like your ancestors, or like your kinsmen who sinned against Adonai, the God of their ancestors, with the result that he allowed them to become the object of horror, as you see. Don't be stiff-necked now, as your ancestors were. Instead, yield yourself to Adonai. Enter his sanctuary, which he has made holy forever, and serve Adonai your God, so that his fierce anger will turn away from you. For if you turn back to Adonai, your kinsmen and children will find that those who took them captive will have compassion on them, and they will come back to this land. Adonai your God is compassionate and merciful. He will not turn his face away from you if you return to him." So the runners passed from city to city through the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh as far as Zebulun. But the people laughed at them and made fun of them. Nevertheless, some from Asher, Manasseh, Zebulun were humbled enough to come to Jerusalem. Also in Yehudah, the hand of God was at work until uniting their hearts to do what the king and the leaders had ordered in accordance with the word of Adonai. Thus, many people assembled in Jerusalem to keep the festival of Matzvot. The second month, a huge crowd. First, they set about removing the altars that were in Jerusalem, and they also removed all the altars for incense and threw them in the Vadi Kidron. Then they slaughtered the Pesach lamb on the 14th day of the second month, assembled themselves. The Kohanim, the Levi'im, had consecrated themselves and brought burnt offerings into the house of Adonai. Now they stood at their stations as prescribed in the Torah of Moshe, the man of God. The Kohanim splashed the blood given to them by the Levi'im, for they were many in the assembly who had not consecrated themselves. Therefore the Levi'im were responsible for slaughtering the Pesach lambs and consecrated them to Adonai on behalf of everyone who was not clean. For a large number of people, especially from Ephraim, Manasseh, Issachar, and Zebulun, had not cleansed themselves, but ate the Pesach lamb anyway, despite what was written. For Hezekiah, who had prayed for them, may Adonai, who is good, pardon everyone who sets his heart on seeking God, Adonai, the God of his ancestors, even if he hasn't undergone the purification prescribed in connection with the holy things. Adonai heard Hezekiah and healed the people. The people of Israel there in Jerusalem observed the festival of Matzot for 7 days with great joy, while every day the Levi'im and Kohen praised Adonai, singing to Adonai with accompaniment of loud instruments. Hezekiah spoke encouragingly to all the Levi'im who were well skilled in the service of Adonai. Thus they ate throughout the festival for 7 days, offering sacrifices of peace offerings and giving thanks to Adonai, the God of their ancestors. When the whole assembly decided to celebrate for yet another 7 days, and they observed those 7 days too with joy. For Hezekiah, king of Yehuda, gave the assembly 1,000 bulls and 7,000 sheep for offering, while the leaders gave the assembly 1,000 bulls and 10,000 sheep, and great numbers of Kohanim consecrated themselves. All the people who had assembled from Yehuda rejoiced, as did the Kohen and the Levi'im, those assembled from Israel, the foreigners who had come from the territory of Israel who lived in Yehuda. So there was great joy in Jerusalem, for since the time of Shlomo, the son of David, king of Israel, there had been nothing like it in Jerusalem. Then the Kohen, who were the Levi'im, stood up and blessed the people. Adonai heard their voice, and their prayer came up to the holy place where he lives, heaven. After all this was over, all Israel who were there went out to the cities of Yehuda and smashed the standing stones, chopped down the sacred poles, and broke down the high places and altars throughout Yehuda, Benjamin, Ephraim, Manasseh, until they had destroyed them all. Then all the people of Israel returned to their own cities, each to his own possession. Hezekiah reestablished the divisions of the Kohanim and Levi'im in accordance with the way the divisions had been before, with each man assigned his task, both the Kohanim and the Levi'im, for burnt offerings and for peace offerings, to serve, give thanks, and to praise at the gates of Adonai's camp. He determined a portion of the king's property to be given to the burnt offerings, that is, for the morning and evening burnt offerings, and the burnt offerings of Shabbats, Rosh Hodesh, and the designated times as prescribed in the Torah of Adonai. He also ordered the people living in Jerusalem to contribute the portion meant for the Kohanim and Levi'im, so that they would be submitting themselves to the Torah of Adonai. As soon as the order was issued, the people of Israel gave an abundance from the first fruits of the grain, wine, and olive oil, honey, and the agricultural produce. They brought the required tenth and more. The people of Israel and Yehuda living in the cities of Yehuda also brought the required tenth of oxen and sheep, and required tenth of consecrated gifts that had been dedicated to Adonai their God, and piled them in heaps. They began accumulating these heaps in the third month, and completed them in the 7th month. When Hezekiah, the leader, came and saw the heaps, they blessed Adonai and his people Israel. When Hezekiah asked the Kohanim and the Levi'im about the heaps, Ezra-Yehu, the chief Kohen from the house of Zadok, answered him, "Ever since the people began bringing offerings into the house of Adonai, we have had enough to eat and plenty left over, for Adonai has blessed his people, and what is left over is this massive supply." Then Hezekiah ordered storerooms prepared for the house of Adonai. After preparing them, they faithfully brought in the offerings, the required tents, and the consecrated things. Konayehu, the Levi, was put in charge of them, with Shimi, his brother, and his assistant. Hezekiah, the king of Ezra-Yehu, the ruler of the house of God, appointed Yehiel, Eziehu, Nechat, Eshiel, Yeramot, Yizabad, Eliel, Yishmecheh, Michat, and Benayehu as supervisors to serve under Kenaiah and Shimi, his brother. Kor, the son of Yimnah, the Levi, gatekeeper of the east gate, was responsible for the voluntary offerings to God. He had to distribute the offerings made to Adonai, and especially holy gifts. Under him were Eden, Menayim, Yeshua, Shimayehu, Emeryehu, Shikayehu, the cities of the Kohanim, faithfully making the distributions of their kinsmen by divisions, great and small alike. Every male 3 years and older, entitled to enter the house of Adonai was given his daily share for performing his duties according to his division, regardless how he was recorded in the genealogies. Likewise, those recorded in the genealogies of the Kohanim by clans received shares, as did the Levi'im, 20 years and older, who were performing their duties in their assigned divisions. When shares were assigned, all their little ones, wives, sons, and daughters, were also recorded in the genealogies throughout their entire community, for in their faithfulness to this task they were consecrated themselves. Finally, shares were assigned to the descendants of Aaron, Kohanim, who lived in the pasture land surrounding their cities. In each city they were mentioned by name. Thus portions were distributed to all the males among the Kohanim. To all those genealogies showed that they belonged to the Levi'im. This is what Hezekiah did throughout all Yehuda. He accomplished things that were good, right, and faithful before Adonai, his God. Every project that he undertook in order to seek his God, whether in the service of the house of God or in the connection with the Torah and the mitzvot, he did with all his heart, and so he succeeded. After these events and his faithfulness of Hezekiah, Sennacherib, king of Ashur, came, invaded Yehuda, and besieged the fortified cities, thinking that he could break in and capture them. When Hezekiah saw that Sennacherib had come and intended to attack Jerusalem, he consulted his leading men, military advisors, about sealing off the water in the springs outside the city. After gaining their support, a large crowd was gathered to block all the springs and the streams flowing throughout the countryside. They reasoned, why should the king of Ashur come and find an ample supply of water? Then, taking courage, he rebuilt all the broken sections of the wall, raised towers on it, built another wall outside that, strengthened the Milo in the city of David, and made large quantities of spears and shields. He appointed military commanders over the people, then gathered them before him in the open space in the city gate, and spoke the words of encouragement to them. Be strong, take courage, don't be afraid or distressed on the account of the king of Ashur and all the horde he brings with him. For the one with us is greater than the one with him. He has human strength, but we have Adonai, our God, to help us fight our battles. The people took heart at the word of Hezekiah, king of Yehuda. After this, while Sennacherib and all his army were besieging Lachish, he sent his envoys to Jerusalem, to Hezekiah, king of Yehuda, and to all Yehuda who were there in Jerusalem with this message. This is what Sennacherib, king of Ashur, says. What gives you the confidence that you can endure a siege against Jerusalem? Hasn't Hezekiah deluded you? Isn't he condemning you to death by starvation and thirst when he says, Adonai, our God, will save us from King Ashur? Isn't this the same Hezekiah who removed your God's high places and altars and ordered Yehuda and Jerusalem to worship before one altar and offer sacrifices on it? Don't you realize that I and my ancestors have done to all the people in all the countries? Were the gods of the nations able to do such a thing to rescue their country from me? Who of all the gods and the nations of my ancestors completely destroyed was able to rescue his people from me? Now, how then will your God rescue you from me? Don't let Hezekiah mislead you or delude you in this way. Don't believe him, for no god or any nation or kingdom has ever been able to rescue his people from me or my ancestors. How much less will your God rescue you from me? His envoys kept on speaking against Adonai, God, and against his servant Hezekiah. He also wrote a letter insulting Adonai, the God of Israel, and speaking against him. It said, just as the gods of the nations and other countries could not rescue their people from me, likewise Hezekiah's God cannot rescue his people from me. They were shouting loudly in the language of the Judeans to the people of Jerusalem who were on the wall in order to terrify them and make them fearful, so that they could capture the city. They spoke about the God of Jerusalem in the same way that about the gods of the other peoples of the earth, which were merely human artifacts. Because of this, Hezekiah, king, and Yeshayahu, the prophet, the son of Amoz, prayed and cried out to heaven. Then Adonai sent an angel who cut down the valiant warriors and the leaders and the officers in the king of Ashur's camp, so that he had to return shamefaced to his own country. When he entered the house of his gods, his own sons, whom he himself had fathered, put to death with a sword there. In this way Adonai rescued Hezekiah, those living in Jerusalem, from Sennacherib, the king of Ashur, and from everyone caring for them in every respect. Many people brought gifts to Adonai in Jerusalem and items of value to Hezekiah, king of Yehuda. To that, from then on, he was regarded highly by all the nations. Around that time, Hezekiah became ill to the point of death. But he prayed to Adonai, who answered him, even giving him a sign. However, Hezekiah did not respond commensurately with the benefit done for him, because he had grown proud. Thus he brought anger on himself and on Yehuda and Jerusalem as well. But Hezekiah then humbled himself for his pride, both he and his people living in Jerusalem, so that Adonai's anger did not strike them during Hezekiah's lifetime. Hezekiah had vast riches and great honor. He provided himself with storage places of silver, gold, precious stones, spices, shields, and all kinds of valuable articles. Also storehouses for the harvest, grain, wine, olive oil, and the stalls for all kinds of livestock and pens for the flocks. He provided cities for himself and purchased flocks and herds in abundance, for God had made him extremely wealthy. It was this same Hezekiah who blocked the upper outlet of the Gishon spring and diverted the water straight down to the west side of the city of David. Hezekiah succeeded in all that he did. However, in the matter of the ambassadors from the princes of Babal, who sent to him to learn of the marvel that had taken place in the land, God left him by himself in order to test him, so that he might know everything that was in his heart. Other activities of Hezekiah and his good deeds are recorded in the vision of Yeshayahu the prophet, the son of Amoz, and in the annals of the kings of Yehuda and Israel. Then Hezekiah slept with his ancestors, and they buried him in the path leading up to the tombs of the descendants of David. All Yehuda and the people living in Jerusalem honored him when he died, after which Manasseh, his son, took his place as king.